Well, good morning, everyone. We are, just to avoid confusion, I'll move out of the light here. Just to avoid confusion, we are still on week one. So this is the second week of week one, okay? If that makes sense, okay? So we're going to try and take a look at Genesis 9 through 13 this morning, and that'll actually finish week one. And then we'll be ready for week two, which will really be week three, but it'll still be week two, okay? This sounds, sort of like IRS regulations or something like that, doesn't it? Okay, so you may remember that we left off last week with making the point that Genesis 1 through 11 is really important because it's the preface to the story of Israel that follows in Genesis 12 all the way through the end of the Old Testament. And so, as I said, we're learning two important things. First, the history of Israel is being set in its proper context, which is the context of creation. So Genesis 1 and 2, which we talked about last week, lets us know that the story that we're about to read is not just simply a story about a particular people in a particular geographic location. That God is doing something through them which is intended to have an effect on the whole world. We'll see that really concretely in just a minute. The second thing that we're being told is we're being told why Israel is necessary. And that comes to what we looked at last week with Genesis 3 and the human beings' fall into sin. So we're going to see God begin the process of creating what you might call an alternative people, okay, whose mission is to live against the grain of a fallen world. And that's what the people of Israel are going to be doing. So let's continue the story. So remember last time we stopped with the flood. And I made the point that one of the things that we want to kind of notice in the story of the flood is that we learn here that there's kind of like a crescendo of sin. So sin begins in Genesis 3, and then it just sort of snowballs from there. There's the story of Cain and Abel, and sin kind of grows, and it becomes sort of like a cancer. In creation, there's the flood. And then at the end of the flood, something really important happens, which I want to kind of spend a few minutes talking about. So the flood comes to an end, the waters subside, and we have Noah and all the creatures and people that were in the ark. And this is Genesis 8:20 and following. Something really important happens. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and took some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. So something really important happens here. This is an act of worship. And we'll be talking about worship extensively when we get into Exodus and then Leviticus too. So I'll save that discussion for then. But one of the things we want to notice right now is just simply this. This building of the altar and the offering of a burnt offering or several burnt offerings is really significant. So a burnt offering, as we'll discover, is when you take an animal, you put it on the altar, and you just sort of like combust the whole animal. It reminds me of my attempts at a cookout. What I was supposed to be barbecuing kind of becomes a burnt offering. But it's really important in this sense. A burnt offering is a sign of complete dedication to God. That's the significance of the whole animal being burned. Okay, the whole thing, you're not benefiting from the animal in any way, shape, or form. You are symbolically giving it all to God, and the animal represents you. We'll talk about sacrifice later on too, but just for now, I think that's enough. So notice what Noah does here. Noah does something that goes against the grain of the world. right? We've seen human beings act on the principle that they are sort of like the lords of creation. That's the definition of sin, right? I am my own God, and I'll do darn well whatever I want to do. That's sort of the operational pattern of sin. Notice what Noah does here. Noah builds an altar and offers this offering to God. This is Noah's way of saying, oh, look, Lord, I acknowledge that you're the creator and I'm the creature. And part of what I need to learn is I need to live before you as a creature in trust and obedience. So Noah here is living against the grain of the world. This one thing you want to kind of put in your memory banks, because we'll be coming back to it many, many times, it's this. One of the purposes of worship is to realign our lives. The purpose of worship is to align life and point it Godward. Okay? That's why we're here every Sunday for our realignment. Okay? We all come here every Sunday so our lives can get like realigned, pointed in the right direction. So that's one thing. The second thing that happens, and this is in Genesis 9, God establishes a covenant with Noah. Let me just read part of it to you for time's sake. Here it is. First, God pronounces a blessing on the people and the animals in the ark and says this, "And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it." Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark, of every beast on the earth." So notice what's going on here. God establishes a covenant, a bond between Noah, his family, but also, and this is important, every living creature. God establishes a covenant. So notice we've got something really important going on here. Well, once again, we'll come back to this as we walk through the Old Testament. But notice, this is really important. Notice that God's kind of first step in redeeming and restoring the world is to create a covenant between himself and all of life. What this means is that Noah, his family, his descendants, we'll see this when we get to Abraham in a few minutes, and all of life now exist in a covenant relationship with the Creator. They are God's covenant partners. Okay, this is really important, right? Because God could have said something like this. Well, look, I'm the Creator. And what's going to happen here is you are all just going to do whatever I say. And when I say jump, your response is going to be, how high? That's not what happens. What happens here is God creates a sacred bond between himself, Noah's family, and all living creatures on the face of the earth. That is, notice what happens here. God, in effect, binds himself in a relationship of faithfulness to Noah's family and to all the living creatures in the world. Okay, and I think maybe the thing we want to kind of think about here, we'll be talking about covenant later on. But think about covenant here in terms of something that the Book of Common Prayer actually identifies as a covenant: marriage. The Book of Common Prayer says that the marriage of a man and a woman who stand at this altar up here is simply an analog of the covenant that exists between Christ and the church. So the idea here is there's a sense in which, right, that this covenant that God makes here is something like a kind of a marriage bond between himself and all of life. God assumes responsibility for Noah's family, but also for all living creatures, and enters into this relationship with them. So it's really important, and I think we just want to kind of think about this. This is actually one of the unique features of the God that we meet in Scripture. God makes covenants, right? And we want to kind of think ahead maybe just a little bit to see how important this covenant is. Remember what happens in the upper room when Jesus spends his last night with his disciples. Remember what he says? This is the new covenant sealed in my blood. So God here is in the process of making covenants with human beings and also with all of life. And one of the things that means is that God can be counted on to be faithful to the promises that he's made. The really important point here, and we'll be coming back to this, is it's really important to understand that the God that we meet here in Scripture is never arbitrary. God doesn't just sort of wake up one day and say, okay, what are we going to do today? Well, let's see. I've taken a particular dislike to Keith Cooksey. What can I do to inflict injury on him? Okay? No, that's not what happens. Okay? The idea here is that God can be counted on to be faithful to his promises. And we see this happening here in the 9th chapter of the book of Genesis. Okay, I want us to take a quick look at Genesis 11, 1 through 9. This is the tail end now of this prologue to the history of Israel. We've been given a series of vignettes that help us to see how serious sin is and God's intention to not destroy creation, but to redeem it. And Genesis 11, 1 through 9 is sort of like the capstone on this story about sin. So we've got enough time, I think, that I can just go ahead and read it to you. Most of us are kind of familiar with it. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. It's kind of a fun story, too. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. As people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they made brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, they have all one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing they propose to do will now become impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. The idea here is that in Hebrew, Babel is the language for Babel. Blah, 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 Babel. That's where it all comes. So let's take a look at what's happening here. So Genesis 11, 1 through 9 is sort of presented as like the capstone of what sin results in. And as you may have noticed here, I've called this section the politics of Sin City. I'm not talking about Washington, D.C. or Tallahassee, though I could be. So this is a little picture, an image of what sin looks like. Okay, so you can talk about things in a variety of ways, right? I could give you like a half-hour discussion of what sin is and how it affects the lives of people, and that probably wouldn't be overly interesting to you. Or, right, I could sort of paint an image of what sin might look like in some life situation. And that's what we have here. This is a painting, a picture of what sin looks like. And let's take a look at what it says. First of all, notice what happens. The people come together and they're building this sort of city. And they say to themselves, okay, look, here's what we're going to do. We are going to build a tower. And they're probably thinking about what's called a ziggurat. It's sort of a Babylonian sort of big high pyramid that has a temple on the you may have seen pictures of it. If you've seen like the temples in Central America built by the Aztecs or the Incas, very similar thing. kind of elevated structure with a temple on top. They get together and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We are going to build an impressive tower temple that's going to be so high, it's actually going to reach up into the heavens. And when everybody sees this tower, they are going to be just bowled over impressed with how wonderful we are. We are going to make a name for ourselves because that's ultimately what it's all about. Now, this is sort of a picture of sin in two rather dramatic ways, right? So dramatic way number one, we don't need to wait for God to come down and meet us. We'll pole vault ourselves up there and we'll meet him. We don't need to wait for God to communicate with us and, heaven knows what he's doing up there and taking his own sweet time about it. We'll just pole vault ourselves into his living room and demand that he pay attention to us. Okay? It's like, I know this never happens to any of you, you're working diligently in your office and you've got your do not disturb sign on the door, right? And someone opens the door of your office. Just one question. I've just got one question. That's what's going on here. So the idea here is that what's going on with the Tower of Babel is it represents a kind of mentality. In terms of thinking about our relationship with God, it's something that we can initiate. And we can kind of like force God to deal with us on our terms, right? Once we've pole vaulted into his living room, we'll kind of tell him how we want to be treated and related to. And that's how things really should be. So that's one part of it. And the second part of it is this. Remember from our discussion of Genesis 1, the original goal, vocation of human beings was to represent God in the world. For these folks, that's not enough. They're dissatisfied with merely kind of being God's representatives. They want to be the masters of the world. They want everything to revolve around them and their agenda. And I think we can kind of think about, right, how this gets lived out in numerous ways, right? Both small and large. The smaller ways would be, in order to, I've got like a really important purpose I want to see through. And if I need to kind of maybe like lie here and misrepresent here and kind of do some harm there, well, that's okay. Because it's what I want to do and it's really important. All the way up to, you see that whole group over there? They're causing problems. If we just got rid of all of them, the world would be a much better place. Let's load them up on railroad cars and we'll send them to re-education camps. And that's how we'll take care of them. And once they're all gone, all our problems will be over. And once again, right, this is a legitimate thing to do because it's what we want. So it gets played out in large and small ways. So that's the politics of Sin City. That is, Genesis 11, 1 through 9 is helping us to see that apart from God, what we can expect is simply disaster. That's what the world's going to look like apart from God. It'll be like one disaster after the next. Now, let's take a look at the flip side of this. And this is Genesis 12. This is where the history of Israel actually starts. And so I want to read to you the first 4 verses of Genesis 12 because I think it kind of says what needs to be said here. So you may kind of think about, this is a study in contrast. So right, we've just looked at this picture of what sin looks like in human life, in human politics, in human relationships. And now we're going to look at a different picture that's very, very different. And the picture here involves a man by the name of Abram. We'll see later on that his name is changed to Abraham, but we'll get to that later. I'll just call him Abram because that's what he's called here. So here's Genesis 12, 1 through 4. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, Mr. Abram, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." I'm going to use you, Abram, to bless the whole human race. Got that? Now the question, of course, here is, what is Abram going to do? Notice the invitation here. It's not fun. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Notice here God's like a really bad travel agent. Leave the place where you grew up. Leave the place where all your family and relatives live. Leave the place that you've come to know over the whole course of your life. And I want you to go to, well, when you get there, I'll let you know. God's like a really, really bad travel agent. And the question, of course, here is, what is Abram going to do? How will he respond to this command? Well, the answer comes in Genesis 12:4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother-in-law's son, and all the possessions they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to the land of Canaan. Now, notice what's going on here. Notice the contrast. God says here, right, Abram, I am going to make you great. And I am going to use you to bless the whole human race. That's the exact opposite of the agenda of the people in Babel. We're going to make ourselves great, and everyone's going to ooh and ah over us. That's what we're doing. Here it's the opposite. Here it's Abram's going to be made great by God, and somehow God is going to use him to bless all of humankind. It's the exact opposite agenda. So now here we've got, this is the beginning of this people who are going to be called Israel. We're going to be reading a lot more about them, but already you can see things are going to be very, very different. God's about to create a people who live against the grain of a sinful world because they think about everything in a very different way. Now, here's something else that happens, and I want to emphasize this too. So Abraham goes on this like poorly arranged cruise. You know, it's like signing up for a Viking River cruise and say, okay, where are we going? Well, you'll find out when we get there. Where are we stopping along the way? Well, you know, we'll just kind of stop wherever we think is like a really interesting place. So Abraham goes on this kind of odd little trip here. And what happens is that he comes into the land of Canaan, the land that we know now today as Palestine or Israel. And he's kind of like given a tour of it. And here's what happens. And Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. So two things about that story are really important. Okay, notice what happens here. First of all, Abram is willing to leave everything that's familiar to him, to trust God, and to go on this journey. So really important point is made here. For the whole Bible, that really summarizes the essence of faith. Faith is the willingness to live in obedience to and trust in God, even though we don't know exactly where we might be going. Right? Faith is the willingness to believe that God's trustworthy. And so we see that right here in Abram. So that's kind of a really important point. But the other thing that we want to notice here is this. Abram's walking through the land of Canaan, and God says to him, okay, now, Abram, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. And that sounds like a wonderful thing, except as Abram is driving down, Interstate 75 through the land of Canaan, he keeps noticing something that's kind of like bothersome. There are like already people there that inhabit the land that God has just promised him. Okay? So it's like, the way that I like to think about this is let's say that I'm like a real estate agent, which I would never be because I wouldn't be really good at it. Let's say, you come to me and you say, I want to find my dream home. And I say, okay, tell me what you want. And so you tell me what you want in your dream home, and I come to you one day and say, okay, I found your dream home. Let's go take a look at it. So off we go. I drive you to your dream home. We pull up in the driveway, and things kind of look a little ominous because, A, there's no for sale sign in the front yard. There's some toys sitting on the driveway. And peering in the backyard, you can see some laundry hanging, violating homeowners' deed restrictions, right? You can see laundry hanging in the backyard. And you say to me, Michael, it looks like this house isn't for sale and that somebody already lives here. And I say, yes, the house isn't for sale and somebody already does live here, but this is your dream home. That's kind of what's happening with poor Abram here. And the question here once again becomes, this is a really important question. Does Abram trust God enough to believe that although he has no idea how he will come to possess this land, that God still can be trusted to give it to him? That's the question, isn't it? Right? If God has made this promise to him, can God be trusted to keep the promise even though Abram has no earthly idea how it's going to be kept? Now, just going to maybe fast forward that for a minute and kind of put this in our context, right? God's promised us a life completely freed from sin and death, right? We don't exactly know how that promise is going to be kept, do we? And as we look around at our world today, right, we sometimes wonder whether it actually can be kept. But once again, right, the question is not whether we can see a means by which the promise can be kept. The real question is, can God be trusted to keep a promise that he's made? That's the real question. That's the question that Abram has to face. One final thing to note here, and that is that in Genesis 12:7, notice what happens here. Abram does something really important too. He builds an altar to God. It's almost like he's been taken on a tour of this land that's already inhabited by other people, and he builds this altar to God as a way of saying, you know what? I have no idea how I'm going to come to acquire this land. But I believe that if you've promised it, it's going to happen. And as a way of signifying that faith, I'm going to build an altar right here and offer a sacrifice to you. This is Abram's response to the promise that God has made to him. One final thing that we want to note here, and that's this. The promise is repeated again in Genesis 13. I'll read it briefly. It's Genesis 13:14 and following. The Lord said to Abram, after he and Lot had separated, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you will see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, they could count your offspring." Now, we know a little important detail here about Abraham's marriage that is really relevant at this point. Not only has God promised this land that is already inhabited, but he's just made a promise to Abram that he's going to have many descendants. One problem stands in the way. Back in Genesis 11, towards the end, as a matter of fact, in Genesis 11:30, we learn a little important fact. Abram's wife, Sarai, is infertile. She can't have children. How's that promise going to be kept? We just want to get a sense here of maybe what's going on in Abram's mind, right? Okay, I've been promised land that's already inhabited by a lot of other people. I've been promised many descendants, and I know that my wife can't have children. And by the way, I'm 75 and no spring chicken. How's this all going to come about? Once again, Abram doesn't really know. And I think one of the things that Genesis 12 and 13 are trying to sort of help us to see is that in many ways, right, the life of faith is kind of like a pilgrimage. It's a journey. And the only thing that really allows it to take place is a deep sense of trust in God and His faithfulness. If we decide to focus on our ability to sort of figure everything out and kind of come to a knowledge of exactly how everything's going to turn out, well, then we'll be in really bad shape. So Abram here has to learn to trust God. And as we get into chapters 14 and following, we'll see how all that gets worked out. But the story of Israel, the story of Abraham's family, has now been launched, and we'll see how God's project to create an alternative people who live against the grain of the world works out. By the way, one little footnote, it's important to recognize that we're part of that people who are called to live against the grain of the world, right? We're part of that people and that family. Okay, we better get going, or we'll be in trouble.